This is the moment the West officially died. Forget the headlines you've seen. The real story is much darker. When the President of the United States labeled the leaders of Europe as vassals, he didn't just break protocol, he incinerated the rules-based international order. Right now, NATO is fracturing, the EU is arming its anti-coercion bazooka, and the dollar is being hunted by its oldest allies. Now, the question isn't whether America is still the leader of the free world. The question is, who's filling the vacuum? At 3:14 a.m. on Wednesday, January 28, 2026, the concept of the West, a geopolitical construct that survived the Blitz, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, was effectively liquidated. It did not require a saturation strike or a coordinated cyber assault on the power grid. It required only a thumb-typed manifesto, fueled by a cornered leader's delusional need to reassert a fading hegemony. In a series of all-caps posts, the President of the United States didn't just breach diplomatic decorum, he executed a schism from reality. Why did this digital outburst succeed where decades of Soviet subversion failed? Because it targeted the psychological foundation of the Atlantic Alliance, the assumption of mutual respect. By categorizing the G7 leaders as vassals who begged on their knees, the president explicitly revived the logic of imperialism, stripping sovereign nations of their democratic legitimacy. This was vassalage redefined for the digital age, a declaration that the U.S. no longer views its allies as partners, but as provinces in a protection racket. The rhetoric regarding Greenland was not merely an eccentric real estate obsession, it was a formal incineration of the rules-based order. By asserting, Greenland is mine, the administration signaled a transition from a security guarantor to a predatory land power. This is the belligerence of a declining power attempting to stop the clock. The West didn't die in a war room. It died in a mud pit of instability while the world's diplomats were asleep. By 8 a.m., the global response shifted from shock to a cold, calculated, retaliatory posture. The joint statement from London, Paris, and Berlin was not a plea for clarity. It was a certificate of death for the special relationship. The phrase appalling and false functions as a definitive degradation of the American presidency. To call a sitting U.S. president's claims false is to categorize him as a systemic liar. To call them appalling is to label the U.S. a pariah state on moral grounds. The most lethal blow came from London. For a British Prime Minister to stand with Brussels against Washington is the ultimate geopolitical divorce. The UK, historically the bridge between the old world and the new, chose national dignity over the fading promise of the dollar. They realized that under this brand of coercion, there is no seat at the table, only a leash. The liquidation of the Atlantic Bridge was formalized by the diplomatic recall of G7 ambassadors. In the cold language of the State Department, this is the final step before the total severance of ties. As these diplomats boarded their flights, they left behind a Washington isolated by its own sycophants and trapped in a feedback loop of incapacity. The Trump discount that markets once tolerated has officially mutated into a permanent Trump tax, a price that every American citizen will now pay as the world begins the process of total divestment from the American dream. How does a rules-based trade bloc transform into an economic predator without firing a single shot? The answer lies in the Anti-Coercion Instrument, ACI, a legislative bazooka originally forged by Brussels to deter Chinese influence, now recalibrated to dismantle American market dominance. The ACI is not a mere tariff schedule. It is a clinical framework for state-sponsored retaliation. It allows the European Commission to bypass the glacial pace of the WTO to strike at the heart of the U.S. economy, Silicon Valley, and the financial services sector. The technical mechanics are as precise as they are lethal. Under the ACI, Brussels can categorize the Vassal Manifesto as a formal act of coercion, an attempt to interfere in the sovereign policy choices of member states through economic blackmail. This triggers an ex officio investigation, authorizing the EU to suspend intellectual property protections, block public procurement contracts, and impose digital service levies that function as a targeted tax on American tech gatekeepers. For companies like Apple, Amazon, and Meta, which have built their global empires on the bedrock of the European single market, The ACI is an existential threat. It reclassifies data as a raw material subject to border adjustment taxes, effectively fire-mauling the U.S. tech sector behind a wall of regulatory fines. The geopolitical irony is profound. The U.S. spent the better part of a century championing the freedom of the seas and open markets. Now its own rhetoric has provided the EU with the legal pretext to close those markets. The ACI represents the birth of European economic sovereignty, a world where the EU no longer asks for permission but dictates terms through coercion-resistant trade barriers. Silicon Valley is about to discover that the cloud still has a physical and legally vulnerable address in Brussels. What happens when the world's largest creditor decides that the world's largest debtor is no longer mentally competent? The answer is not found in a political speech, but in the cold, binary sell orders emanating from the Bank of Japan. As the single largest foreign holder of U.S. government debt, Japan has long served as the silent stabilizer of the American fiscal experiment. That silence ended at 3:14 a.m. The Japanese Treasury liquidation is the most potent financial weapon in the global arsenal. By initiating a coordinated sell-off of U.S. Treasuries, the Japanese government has triggered a yield shock that transcends mere market volatility. In the debt markets, yields move inversely to prices. As trillions of dollars in U.S. debt are dumped onto the market, the price of treasuries collapses, forcing interest rates to skyrocket. We are no longer discussing marginal increases. We are looking at the 10% ghost, a scenario where U.S. 10-year yields soar to double digits to attract remaining capital. The domestic fallout is an economic apocalypse. At 10% interest, the American housing market, the primary engine of middle-class wealth, simply evaporates. Mortgage rates tied to Treasury yields become unattainable for 95% of the population. The Trump discount has officially been replaced by a liquidation event that targets the very base the president claims to protect. The American dream isn't being stolen. It's being auctioned off by the Japanese Ministry of Finance to cover the cost of U.S. instability. Can a real estate metaphor be litigated as a territorial invasion under international law? To the occupant of the Oval Office, "Greenland is mine" was a punchline designed to project strength. To the legal scholars in The Hague, it is a textbook violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. By claiming ownership of territory it does not possess, the U.S. government has created a formal legal liability that could lead to its standing as a pariah state being codified in court. The International Court of Justice, ICJ, is the venue for this reckoning. Denmark, supported by a unified EU, has the standing to sue the U.S. for a declaration of sovereignty infringement. The U.S. defense that the claim was mere political hyperbole crumbles under the weight of vassalage rhetoric. Under international law, sovereignty is not a commodity to be purchased, but a right rooted in self-determination. By treating a sovereign nation as a real estate asset, the U.S. has invalidated the very treaties it once used to restrain adversaries like Russia and China. The consequences extend beyond a courtroom loss. An ICJ ruling against the U.S. would provide the legal green light for every other nation to ignore U.S.-led sanctions and treaties. If the U.S. ignores the UN Charter on sovereignty, why should Iran follow the nuclear deal? Why should Russia stay within its borders? For the first time in history, the leader of the free world might be forced to defend a land grab charge in a court it no longer recognizes. And in doing so, it will find itself alone in a world governed by the very laws it chose to incinerate. Is NATO still a security alliance if the members are meeting to discuss defense against the alliance leader? This is no longer a rhetorical exercise. By 2 p.m., the Baltic states and Poland took the unprecedented step of formally invoking Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Historically, Article 4 has been the precursor to collective action against external aggression, typically from Moscow. Today, it was triggered to address the indirect aggression and psychological belligerence of a sitting U.S. president. The technical implications of this move represent a total inversion of the Atlanticist hierarchy. Under Article 4, any member can mandate emergency consultations when their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. By threatening to let the wolves eat the allies, the president did not just insult them, he fundamentally compromised their national security. The resulting emergency meeting in Brussels, notably excluding the American delegation, transformed NATO into a containment mechanism for U.S. volatility. The shield has become the sword, pointed not at the Kremlin, but at the unpredictability of a commander-in-chief whose 3 a.m. impulses now carry the weight of a declaration of war. When the protector becomes the wolf, the sheep don't just scatter. They arm themselves with nuclear teeth and seek a new shepherd. Did Donald Trump just become the most effective salesperson in the history of the Chinese Communist Party? While Washington burns its bridges, Xi Jinping is presiding over a BRICS Plus summit that is meticulously engineered to project an image of steady governance to the global South. The Vassal Manifesto is the greatest gift ever delivered to Chinese state media. It provides a living, all-caps proof of concept for the CCP's central narrative, that the United States is a declining hegemon that treats its partners as colonial subjects. The strategic reshuffling currently underway is not merely a shift in rhetoric. It is a fundamental realignment of trade flows. As the U.S. enters a period of self-imposed isolation and faces the anti-coercion instrument from Europe, China is stepping into the vacuum with respect-based trade deals. By alienating the G7, the U.S. has effectively handed the keys to the global economy to Beijing on a silver platter. The global South is watching the vassal tweet on a loop, drawing the obvious conclusion: if this is how America talks to its best friends in London and Paris, what chance do they have? While Washington tweets in all caps about Greenland, Beijing is signing the long-term energy and infrastructure contracts that will define the next century of global trade. Will Germany finally break its post-1945 taboo and pursue a military dimension for its nuclear energy? The folding of the U.S. nuclear umbrella has left a security vacuum that cannot be filled by conventional forces alone. The response is the rapid birth of strategic autonomy, centered on a Gallic umbrella. For decades, France's force de frappe was a sovereign national deterrent. Today, Paris has signaled its willingness to extend that protection to the rest of the continent. This is the birth of the Europeanization of nuclear risk. Under the new Macron doctrine, the vital interests of France now explicitly include the territorial integrity of its EU partners. We are witnessing a desperate, high-stakes transition where the Atlantic Alliance is replaced by a localized European deterrent. Germany, the historical linchpin of the American security architecture in Europe, is now openly discussing the revival of its nuclear program to provide the industrial and financial backbone for a French-led force. The nuclear umbrella hasn't disappeared. It's just being restitched with a French and German needle, and it is pointedly being built to function without a single American component. The era of U.S. extended deterrence didn't end with a treaty. It ended with a world that realized it could no longer bet its survival on the mood of one man in a 3 a.m. fever dream. Is silence a sign of loyalty, or the sound of a constitutional coup being calculated in decibels? Inside the West Wing, the air has the pressurized stillness that precedes a structural collapse. While the crowds outside chant for the dissolution of the state, the vice president remains a ghost. This silence is not accidental. It is the prerequisite for the Section 4 mechanism. To move against a sitting president, the vice president must first secure a majority of the cabinet, a task that requires a delicate, whispered tally of those who prefer the republic to the man. The argument for removal is no longer ideological, it is clinical. Constitutional scholars and high-ranking officials are documenting a pattern of delusional behavior, specifically the hallucination of non-existent treaties and the erratic belligerence of 3 a.m. executive decrees. The incapacity of the president to distinguish between a personal real estate portfolio and sovereign territory has moved the 25th Amendment from a liberal fantasy to a conservative survival strategy. The most dangerous room in the world isn't the Situation Room. It's the vice president's private office, where the decision to become the Brutus of the Beltway is weighed against the certainty of a total party liquidation. Can a superpower survive when its city on a hill turns into a bunker in a mud pit? The era of American hegemony did not end with a decisive battlefield defeat. It succumbed to the slow internal rot of its own institutions. The Vassal Manifesto was merely the terminal symptom. What remains is a pariah state with the world's largest nuclear arsenal and a currency that no longer commands the world's trust. The Trump tax is now a permanent fixture of the global economy. It is the premium the rest of the world charges to deal with a nation that has traded its decorum for a feedback loop of sycophants. The lights in the city on a hill have been extinguished, not by an external enemy, but by an internal retreat into a mental bunker. As the G7 formalizes a post-American trade bloc and the Gallic Umbrella expands, the United States finds itself in a state of geopolitical schism. The locks have been changed, the world has moved on. The tombstone of the American century bears only 3 words, chiseled in the cold marble of history: appalling and false.